My boss stole my idea, took credits for IT and then fired me. This is how the real world works, he laughed. The next morning, our biggest contract was cancelled. When he called the client in a panic, I answered, "You're speaking with the new CEO? They say you should never make your career your identity. But when you're a single mother rebuilding her life from scratch, it doesn't feel like a choice." I'm Claire Harper. I'm 39 years old, and until last week, I was the senior project strategist at Carson & Blake, a fast-growing consulting firm in Chicago. I was also the one who designed the project plan that landed them the $20 million Faulkner Industries contract, the biggest in company history. But that's not what my personnel file will say. This is how the real world works. My boss laughed as he slid the termination papers across his desk. Don't take it personally. He called it restructuring. I called it betrayal. The moment felt surreal. His office smelled of stale coffee and expensive cologne, and the air conditioner hummed too loudly for a February morning. I stared at the documents in front of me, my ears buzzing. After 5 years of building the firm's most complex strategies, after working late nights and missing recitals and holidays with my daughter Ellie, I was being dismissed like a disposable assistant, effective immediately. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said with a shrug, not looking sorry at all. "But we need fresh voices, new energy. You know how this goes." No, I didn't. Not like this. Not after what I'd given them. "Just breathe," I told myself, holding my chin high. I didn't want him to see the tremble in my hands. I wouldn't give him that. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said quietly, standing to leave. He looked surprised by my calmness. I suspect he expected tears, outrage, maybe even begging. But when you've rebuilt your life from nothing once, you learn how to walk away with your dignity even when it feels like your lungs are collapsing. I didn't ask why he hadn't mentioned my project in the meeting. I didn't need to. 2 weeks earlier, I had finished the Faulkner proposal, the most complicated. I didn't need to. 2 weeks earlier, I had finished the Faulkner proposal, the most complicated high-stakes pitch we'd ever attempted. I'd spent 3 months on it, building the strategy, crunching the data, aligning it to their growth forecasts. It had taken every ounce of my skill. The day before the presentation, I'd found the final version on his desk. My name was nowhere on it. "Don't worry, Claire," he'd said then, waving it off like an afterthought. "This is just how these things work. You'll get credit internally." I didn't push back. I should have. Now I was being walked out of the office by a woman from HR I barely knew. My cardboard box in hand, my email disabled, my keycard deactivated before I even reached the elevator. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for nearly an hour gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my throat. I wasn't just angry, I was gutted. Not because I'd been fired, though that stung, but because I'd let him use me. Because I'd seen it coming and still gave him everything I had. As I drove home through the sleet, I thought about Ellie, about the rent, the tuition, the braces I still needed to pay for. I thought about the months of working until 1 a.m., of waking up with my laptop still open beside me, of the nights Ellie had eaten dinner alone while I finished just one more thing. I thought about the time he told me, "You don't have a killer instinct, Claire. That's what's holding you back." He was wrong. That night, as the city froze outside my window, I opened my personal laptop and logged into my cloud archive. I'd saved every version of the Faulkner proposal, every edit, every note, including the original concept sketch with my name and timestamp. I hadn't meant to be strategic. I just believe in backing up my work. What I didn't know then, what he didn't know, is that the head of Faulkner Industries, Sophia Lynn, was a former client of mine. We'd worked together 6 years ago when she was still running her startup. She'd once told me, "If you ever need a real opportunity, call me. The people who build things deserve more than the people who sell them." I never called, but maybe it was time. As I stared at my inbox, her name sat at the top of my contacts like a forgotten promise. I clicked compose. Subject: the real author of your proposal, Sophia. I hope this finds you well. You may not remember me, but we worked together during your early funding round. I'm writing because I recently left Carson & Blake, and there's something you need to know about the Faulkner proposal. My fingers hovered over send. What I didn't realize then was that this single email would set off a chain of events that would unravel the very company that thought they could erase me, and that by the end of the week, I'd be sitting in the executive chair across from my former boss, not as an employee, but as his client. By the time I hit send, my hands were trembling. It wasn't fear, it was adrenaline, the kind that comes from finally standing up after being knocked down too many times. I didn't know if Sophia would even read the email, let alone respond, but at least I had spoken. At least I hadn't just disappeared quietly like they expected me to. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the silence of my apartment broken only by the sound of Ellie breathing softly in the next room. She'd fallen asleep on the couch waiting for me to come out of my room. I hadn't told her what happened yet. I didn't want to scare her, not until I knew what came next. At 7:02 the next morning, my phone buzzed. Sophia Lynn. Claire. Of course I remember you. I still use the growth model you built for our Series B funding round. Thank you for reaching out. Let's talk. I have some questions and an opportunity I think you'll want to hear about. Sophia. I sat up so fast I nearly spilled my coffee. Sophia Lynn wasn't just the CEO of Faulkner Industries now. She was a rising star in the tech world, known for being sharp, ethical, and unafraid to shake things up. If she wanted to talk, this wasn't just a courtesy reply. I called her that afternoon. Her assistant put me through immediately. Claire? Sophia said, her voice calm but clipped. I've reviewed the documents you sent. There was a pause long enough for me to brace for impact, and I'm livid. I thought you should know the proposal wasn't authored by the person who presented it to you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. That was my work. Of course it was, she said. I knew the moment I saw the wording. It had your fingerprints all over it. She asked questions, sharp, detailed ones, about the research, the data modeling, even the way I'd structured the risk mitigation plan. I answered them easily, not because I'd rehearsed, but because it was mine. Every single piece of it. Claire, she said finally, I'm terminating the contract with Carson and Blake. Effective immediately. My heart skipped. You're sure? Absolutely. I don't do business with liars, she said, then added, and I don't reward theft, but I don't believe in letting great work go to waste either. We still need this strategy implemented. I was already planning to launch a new venture. I want you to come in as a partner and CEO. It's yours if you want it. I blinked, unable to form words. You always had a mind for building, Claire. You just never had the space to lead. I can give you that, but I need an answer quickly. I want to hit the ground running. I was quiet for a long moment. I need to think about it, I said finally, though my heart already knew. I understand, she said, but don't take too long. You deserve more than a footnote in someone else's story. We ended the call, and I sat in silence, the phone still in my hand. Me, CEO. I thought about everything that had led here, the late nights, the overlooked contributions, the patronizing feedback. I thought about the phrase that had haunted me since yesterday. This is how the real world works. He was right, in a way. The real world did work like that until someone decided it wouldn't anymore. That night, I told Ellie everything. She was sitting cross-legged on my bed, wrapped in her favorite oversized hoodie. They fired you? She asked, her eyes wide. But you work harder than anyone. I know, I said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, but it's okay. Something better might be coming. She looked at me seriously, like only a 13-year-old who's had to grow up too fast can. Are you scared? Yes, I said honestly, but I'm also ready. The next morning I called Sophia. I'm in. Good, she said. Your new title is CEO of Lynn Harper Consulting. I've already put the paperwork in motion. 2 hours later, the news broke. Faulkner Industries cancels contract with Carson and Blake, citing leadership concerns. Inside sources said the company was caught off guard. I smiled as I imagined the look on my former boss's face when he saw the headline, but that was only the beginning. The next day, his assistant tried to set up a call with Faulkner to salvage the partnership. Sophia forwarded the email to me with a short note. He wants to talk to the CEO. Your move. And so the next morning, when the call was finally patched through and his voice came on the line, panicked, desperate, I took a breath, straightened my posture, and said the words I'd been waiting for. This is Claire Harper. You're speaking with the new CEO. The silence on the other end was electric. For a moment, all I could hear on the other end of the line was shallow breathing. Claire, he finally said, I wasn't expecting you. I figured, I replied, keeping my voice even. You were trying to reach the CEO of Lynn Harper Consulting? That's me now. He gave a weak chuckle, the kind someone uses when they're scrambling to regain control of a situation they've already lost. Look, Claire. This is clearly some kind of misunderstanding. I didn't know there was an issue between you and Carson and Blake. Had I known you were still involved, I would have handled things differently. I let that hang in the air for a second, the audacity of it. You didn't know? I said slowly. You removed my name from the final version of the Faulkner proposal. You presented my work as your own, then you fired me 2 days later. But you didn't know there was an issue? His voice shifted, more defensive now. I was under pressure. The board wanted cuts. I had to make hard decisions. You know how this business works. And honestly, Claire, you're a talented analyst, but you were never leadership material. That stung more than I expected. Not because I believed him, but because it was the same line I'd heard for years. Too quiet, too methodical, too precise, too much, but somehow never enough. You made a mistake, he continued. And I don't just mean walking away. You're burning bridges you might need later. Think about your future. Think about your daughter. That was the moment I felt the shift. He just tried to weaponize my child against me. You don't get to bring my daughter into this, I said, my tone colder now. And I'm not burning bridges, I'm building my own. There was a long pause followed by a deep sigh. You know, he said, you used to be different. You used to be grateful. That word, grateful, as if everything I'd earned was a favor. I was never grateful for the way I was treated, I said. I was committed, loyal, but that loyalty ended when you decided I was dispensable. I'm not the one who should be worried about the future, you are. I ended the call. That same day, Sophia and I met in her downtown office. It was sleek, modern, and filled with light, but it wasn't the design that struck me. It was the energy. Everyone moved with purpose. It felt alive. You handled that perfectly, she said after I told her about the call. But brace yourself. People like that don't go quietly. She was right. By Thursday, the story started circulating. First on LinkedIn, then in internal channels I still had contacts in. He was spinning a new narrative that I'd left the firm voluntarily after underperforming, that I'd been bitter, unstable, difficult to manage. It was so familiar, so predictable. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through my records, emails, project logs, performance reviews. For 5 years I documented everything, not because I expected to need it, but because I was the kind of person who always kept the receipts. That night, I received a message from Julia, a former colleague. Claire, I don't know if you've seen what's being said, but I want you to know I've got your back. We all know the truth, and if you ever need a witness, I'm in. She wasn't the only one. Over the next 2 days I got more than a dozen calls and messages from former coworkers, all sharing similar experiences. Credit taken, promotions denied, voices ignored. Many of them had been too afraid to speak up. Some were still there quietly surviving. You were the first to walk away, Julia said. But now that you have, some of us are ready to follow. By the end of the week, I had more than support. I had documentation, screenshots, messages, internal memos, pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture of years of manipulation, mismanagement, and unethical behavior. The best part? I didn't need to use any of it because the board of Carson & Blake was already getting nervous. On Monday morning a notice appeared on their investor page. The Faulkner contract had been officially terminated. Revenue projections were revised downward. Stock value dropped 6% by midday. And then I got the email I hadn't expected. Claire, this is confidential, but the board is investigating leadership conduct. Several partners have raised concerns about the handling of key accounts, including Faulkner. There's talk of a leadership transition. You didn't just walk away, you exposed something we'd all been ignoring. Anonymous. I read it 3 times before closing my laptop. My hands were steady now. He said I'd made a mistake, but it was starting to look like the only mistake I'd made was staying as long as I did. By the following week the whispers had turned into headlines. Top consulting firm loses flagship client amidst leadership controversy. Carson & Blake in crisis mode after executive shakeup. I watched from my home office as the updates poured in, my laptop open, my phone lighting up every few minutes with new messages. Each one felt like a quiet vindication, not because I wanted revenge, but because the truth was finally forcing its way to the surface. The same truth they tried to bury me with. At Lynn Harper, things were moving fast. Sophia and I were building a team, smart, sharp people, some of whom had left Carson & Blake not long after I did. Others came from Sophia's network. But every single one of them shared the same motivation, to build something honest, ethical, and excellent. For the first time in years, I wasn't just executing someone else's strategy. I was creating the blueprint. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. My former boss, let's call him Matt for clarity, wasn't someone who accepted defeat. Not quietly. Not ever. That Friday my lawyer Dana called me. You're not gonna like this, she said flatly. Go ahead, I replied, bracing myself. Carson & Blake filed a cease and desist order against you, claiming you used proprietary information from your time there to launch your own business and poach their client. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. You mean the client whose contract I wrote, whose strategy I designed, and who was already a professional contact of mine before I even joined Carson & Blake? Dana snorted. Exactly, it's a scare tactic. They're hoping you'll panic and settle quietly, or better yet, fold. Let them try, I said. We documented everything. We did, but I want to be proactive. We're filing a countersuit, defamation, wrongful termination, and professional misrepresentation. We'll also be submitting supporting statements from your former colleagues. Some are already signed. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the city skyline beyond my window. It felt surreal. A month ago, I was just trying to hold on to a job. Now I was defending my name in legal filings and winning back control of my narrative. But what surprised me most wasn't how fast things escalated, it was how many people showed up for me. People like Nathan, one of the senior analysts I'd mentored. He reached out late that night. Claire, I've stayed quiet too long. I knew what Matt was doing. We all did. You were the reason our strategies worked, he just took the glory. I've attached a timeline of project credits showing where your name was removed or replaced in internal documents. Use it if you need to. Nathan. Then came Alicia, a former HR rep who'd left 6 months before me. Matt pushed to change your performance evaluations the quarter before you were fired. I have the original files. You were rated exceeds expectations before it was altered to meets expectations. They were laying the groundwork to remove you. Alicia, I sat with that for a long time. Even knowing what I knew, it still hurt. Not because I believed their lies, but because they were so deliberate in crafting them. They hadn't just used me, they'd erased me. But now, piece by piece, I was reclaiming the space they tried to deny me. Dana moved fast. Within days, she filed the response, attaching documented proof of my original work, email threads with Sophia, and statements from 5 former employees, all of them willing to testify under oath. The cease and desist was dropped within 48 hours, no apology, no explanation, just silence. It was the clearest admission of guilt I could have asked for. The next week, Sophia and I presented our official launch deck to potential investors. Our pitch? A consulting firm rooted in integrity, built by women, focused on sustainable strategy over short-term wins. The room was electric. We secured our first 2 contracts that afternoon. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt a wave of emotions, pride, disbelief, and an undercurrent of grief for the years I'd spent waiting for permission to lead. I had always thought the house would win, that the systems in place were too rigid, too protected. But sometimes, the house forgets. It's the people doing the work who hold it up, and when those people walk away, the whole structure shakes. That night, I picked Ellie up from school. She ran to the car smiling in that bright all-teeth kind of way. "How was your day?" I asked. She buckled her seatbelt then turned to me. "My teacher asked us who inspires us the most. I said you." I looked over trying to keep my throat from tightening. "Why me?" I asked softly. "Because you didn't let them stop you, and because now you're the boss." I smiled, eyes stinging with tears. Not just because she saw me, but because for the first time I saw myself clearly too. By the end of the month, our new company was already making noise. Lynn Harper Consulting had officially onboarded 2 major clients, one of them a direct competitor of Carson & Blake. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same firm that once told me I lacked executive polish was now watching from the sidelines while I led strategy calls with Fortune 500 decision-makers. But this wasn't about revenge. Not anymore. It was about taking back space and redefining what leadership looked like. Still, something shifted when the first media outlet called. The article was titled, "From Discarded to Disruptor, the Woman Who Turned Her Firing into a CEO Role." The reporter had done her homework. She knew about the Faulkner contract, about my termination, and even referenced internal memos that had mysteriously been leaked. "I'm not looking for a fight," I told her during our phone interview, "but I am tired of pretending that what happened was normal. It wasn't, and I'm not the only one." When the piece went live, the response was overwhelming. Messages flooded in from other women, former employees, even people I didn't know. This gave me the courage to speak up at work. "Your story is mine. Different names, same playbook. I've been silent too long, thank you." I should have felt proud, empowered. But something inside me tightened instead. Because with every person who reached out, I realized just how widespread the damage was. It wasn't just me. It never had been. And now everyone was watching, including Carson and Blake. 2 days after the article dropped, Dana called me. "They've hired a crisis management firm," she said. "They're trying to get ahead of this. I wouldn't be surprised if they make a public statement soon." "Let them," I replied. But it wasn't just a statement, it was a full-on campaign. They published a blog post on their website titled, "Moving Forward, Learning from the Past and Building Stronger." It was filled with vague language about miscommunications, team transitions, and internal improvements. They didn't name me, but it was clear they were trying to control the damage. Then Matt resurfaced. "A podcast interview, of course. I think we live in an age where people are quick to assign blame," he said smoothly. "Look, I've made mistakes. We all have. But the truth is, not everyone is cut out for the pressure of leadership. Sometimes people misinterpret decisions that are just part of running a business." It was so perfectly rehearsed I almost laughed. But what came next surprised even me. That night, I received a message request from someone I hadn't spoken to in over 10 years. Nina Rhodes, former senior partner, co-founder of Carson & Blake. She had retired quietly before I was ever promoted to senior strategist, but her name still carried weight in the industry. Her message was short. "Claire, I've been following what's happening. I believe you. If you're open to it, I'd like to meet." We met for coffee in a quiet corner cafe in Lincoln Park. She looked older than I remembered, but carried herself with the same quiet authority. I stepped down before Matt took over full control. She said, "I saw some of the decisions being made, and knew I didn't want to be part of that direction, but I never expected things to fall apart this quickly." "You knew?" I asked. She nodded. "I suspected, but I didn't have proof, and I wasn't brave enough to dig deeper." I studied her face. There was no performance in her eyes, just regret. "You weren't the only one he tried to erase," she continued. "You were just the first one to hold him accountable." She reached into her bag and handed me a flash drive. These are internal evaluations, meeting transcripts, and board communications from my last 6 months at the firm. I think they'll support your case if you choose to take this further. I took it. Heart thudding. Why now? Because it's time the truth had more advocates than excuses, she said simply. And because you reminded me what real leadership looks like. We sat in silence for a moment. 2 women from 2 different chapters of the same story, one walking away from a legacy, the other reclaiming her own. That night, I opened the drive. She wasn't exaggerating. There were memos highlighting intentional manipulation of performance reviews, transcripts of strategy meetings, where Matt discussed using layoffs as a distraction tool during PR crises, even a draft presentation to the board titled, Restructure Plan, quietly replace high-risk staff before IPO consideration. I wasn't a risk because of performance. I was a risk because I knew too much, and because I asked too many questions. The next morning, I forwarded the materials to Dana. Her response came just 3 minutes later. We need to take this public. This isn't just about your story anymore. This is systemic. Are you ready? I stared at her message for a long time. Ready? Number prepared? Absolutely. The decision to go public wasn't made lightly. I spent that entire weekend reviewing everything with Dana, line by line, file by file, making sure every document, every timeline, every name was accurate. We weren't just exposing misconduct, we were setting a precedent. By Monday morning, the story had been submitted to the Wall Street Ledger, accompanied by a full evidentiary file. We also prepared a formal complaint to be sent to the state's Department of Labor and the SEC, citing patterns of employee misrepresentation and fraudulent investor disclosures during performance review periods. I thought I'd feel terrified when it all went live, but I wasn't. I felt calm, focused, free. The article went viral within hours. Consulting giant accused of systemic retaliation against whistleblowers. Internal documents leaked. From CEO to scapegoat, the collapse of Carson & Blake's culture. Former strategist Claire Harper sparks industry reckoning. Suddenly, I had become the story. Not the woman who was fired, but the woman who refused to be erased. My phone didn't stop buzzing for 3 days. Journalists, former employees, women in consulting firms from New York to San Francisco. Some called it courageous, others called it career suicide. But for me, it was neither. It was necessary. On Wednesday morning, Sophia walked into my office holding 2 coffees and a huge smile. You broke the internet, she said, setting 1 cup down in front of me. I didn't mean to, I replied. Exactly why it worked. She sat across from me studying my face. How are you really? I paused, exhausted but strong. I knew you'd be the one to change things, she said softly, but I didn't expect the ripple effect. She wasn't exaggerating. Within a week, 2 high-profile executives resigned from Carson & Blake. Anonymous sources confirmed the board had been aware of internal misconduct for years and had actively downplayed concerns. A former HR director came forward on record, confirming systematic efforts to downgrade performance reviews and silence employees who raised concerns. The firm's legal counsel issued a statement promising a top-to-bottom restructuring. Matt? He was placed on immediate administrative leave pending an internal investigation. His LinkedIn bio vanished overnight. No posts, no spin, just silence. I didn't gloat, not even for a second. Because this was never about revenge, it was about recognition. Recognition for the hundreds of employees like me, quiet builders, invisible architects. The ones who make things work behind the scenes and are then dismissed without a second thought. It was about rewriting the ending for ourselves, for each other. Ellie and I sat on the porch that Friday evening. The air was warm for spring, and the sky was painted with streaks of orange and purple. Mom, she said looking up from her phone, you're on TV again. I chuckled. I know. Getting tired of seeing my face? No, she said, leaning against my shoulder. I think it's cool. You didn't let them treat you like you didn't matter. I kissed the top of her head, feeling the weight of what that meant. Not just for me, but for what she now believed was possible in her own life. Later that night, I sat at my desk, looking over an invitation from a university in Boston. They wanted me to speak at their annual Women in Leadership Summit. The title they'd assigned, How to Be the Architect of Your Own Power. I accepted, not because I wanted the spotlight, but because someone needed to say it out loud. The way things have always been isn't the way they have to stay. The following month, Carson & Blake formally settled the case, a confidential financial resolution, public apology, and the resignation of 3 additional partners. More than money, the settlement required them to implement new employee protections, an independent ethics board, and quarterly transparency reports. It wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. As part of the agreement, I declined a non-disclosure clause. If they thought they could buy my silence, they hadn't been paying attention. I stayed on as CEO of Lynn Harper, guiding the firm into its 2nd year with a new client portfolio, a reputation for integrity, and a waiting list of applicants wanting to join. But more importantly, I stayed visible. Because stories like mine only matter when they're told, when they remind others that their experiences aren't isolated, that silence isn't the price we pay for survival, that we get to decide when our story ends. And for me, this wasn't the end at all. It was the beginning.
After reusing to help pay for my college, parents now expect me to give $150,000 for my sister's expensive wedding. So I refused them, remembering the words they said many years ago. Then sister burst into my apartment. I grew up in a small town, in a modest 2-story house with my parents, and my older sister Grace. She was just 2 years older than me, but sometimes it felt like we lived in completely different worlds. My father owned a small cafe that brought in enough to keep us comfortable, while mom stayed home and occasionally helped out at the restaurant. It wasn't a luxurious life, but we got by. Well, most of us did. Grace, sweetheart, that presentation was absolutely brilliant. I remember mom gushing one evening after a school event. You're going to go so far in life. You're just so talented. I stood in the doorway still holding my own certificate from the science fair, but nobody seemed to notice. It was always like that. Grace was the star, and I was the shadow. That was the pattern of my childhood. Grace got the latest iPhone while I inherited her old one with the cracked screen. She wore designer clothes while I got her hand-me-downs. Every family gathering became a showcase of Grace's achievements. Did you hear about Grace's SAT scores? Dad would proudly tell our relatives, top percentile. And she's president of the debate club too. I learned to fade into the background during these conversations. Knowing my straight B's and position as treasurer of the environmental club wouldn't merit a mention. It wasn't that I was doing poorly, I was doing fine. But in our house, fine might as well have been failure. Stella, mom said to me once when I was helping her fold laundry, you should really think about practical career options. Maybe something in retail or service. There's nothing wrong with honest work. The word stung, but I'd gotten used to the constant reminders of my perceived limitations. What I hadn't gotten used to was the way they seemed to actively work to reinforce them. Looking back now, I realize that those early years were setting the stage for everything that would follow. The constant comparisons, the subtle put-downs, the clear message that I was somehow less than my sister, it all left marks that would take years to heal. But sometimes the deepest wounds become the strongest motivations, and my family had no idea how their treatment would eventually come back to shape all our futures. I still remember the day Grace got her college acceptance letter. The whole house erupted in celebration. Mom made her favorite dinner. Dad brought home an expensive bottle of wine, and they spent the entire evening making plans for her future. Our brilliant girl is going to one of the best colleges in the city. Mom couldn't stop beaming. We've been saving for this moment since you were born, sweetheart. I sat quietly at the dinner table, pushing food around my plate, trying to imagine what my own celebration would be like in 2 years. I should have known better. When my turn came, the response couldn't have been more different. I'd worked hard to maintain good grades, joined clubs, and even took extra courses to boost my college applications. But none of that seemed to matter. College? Mom's laugh was sharp and dismissive when I brought up the subject. Stella, be realistic. We just can't afford to send you to. Besides, you're not really college material. But what about all the money you saved for Grace? I asked, my voice shaking. Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. That was different. Grace had a clear path, exceptional grades. You're more suited for practical work. Speaking of which, I could use another waitress at the cafe. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I could work while studying, I pleaded. Please just help me get started. We could borrow from relatives or take out a loan. I'll pay back every penny with interest. I'll even get it in writing with a lawyer. We never borrow from anyone in principle, Mom said coldly. We don't borrow money and we're not going to change our principles for you. You need to accept your limitations and find a suitable job. I spent that night crying in my room, but by morning, determination had replaced my tears. I went to the only people who had ever truly seen me, my grandparents. Grandpa, Grandma, I need your help. I explained everything through tears at their kitchen table. I can't just give up on college. I can't. Grandpa's eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. We don't have savings, sweetheart, but let me see what I can do. No grandchild of mine is going to have their dreams crushed like this. The next few weeks were a roller coaster of emotions. First, the disappointment of the bank rejecting the loan application. Then, the shocking moment when Grandpa announced he was selling their old country house and the plot of land it sat on. The sale of the property provided exactly enough for my college tuition. I applied to study investment management in a city far from home, as far as I could get from the constant reminders of my family's lack of faith in me. The day I left, Mom and Dad didn't even come to say goodbye. Only my grandparents stood at the bus station, Grandma hugging me tight while Grandpa wiped away what he tried to pretend weren't tears. From that day forward, I cut ties with my parents completely. When breaks came and I had to return to town, I stayed with my grandparents in their now smaller house. Their sacrifice meant everything to me, and every time I walked into their modest home, I was reminded of what real family support looked like. After 4 years of hard work, I finally graduated with my degree in investment management. I returned to my hometown with big dreams and a freshly printed diploma, but reality hit hard. The job market wasn't exactly welcoming to new graduates, and I spent weeks sending out applications without any promising responses. Eventually, I landed a position at a small trading company. It wasn't the prestigious investment firm I'd imagined working for, but it was a start. I found a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy, but it was mine, paid for with my own money. Then came the call I never expected. Stella? Grace's voice was sugary sweet on the phone. "It's been ages. You should come over for dinner this weekend. I'd love to catch up." Something in her tone should have warned me, but I agreed. Maybe time had changed things. Maybe we could finally have a real relationship as adults. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived at Grace's house that evening, I immediately knew I'd walked into a trap. My parents were already there, along with Grace's boyfriend. A slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who barely acknowledged my existence. The interrogation began as soon as we sat down to eat. "So Stella," Mom started, her fork poised mid-air. "Tell us about this job of yours." "I'm working at a trading company," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's small, but..." Grace cut in with a laugh. "Trading company? You mean like those discount stores? Honestly, you didn't need a college degree for that. Anyone could walk in off the street and get that job." Unlike Grace, Mom beamed, who's a manager at the Citibank. "And Thomas here is a lawyer with Anderson and Pierce." Grace's boyfriend nodded smugly. "Top law firm in the state. I told you college wasn't necessary for you," dear Mom sighed. "Such a waste of your grandfather's property." Dad chuckled, swirling his wine glass. "Hey, my offer still stands. I could use an educated waitress at the cafe. Think how impressed the customers would be. Would you like fries with that from someone with a college degree?" They all laughed, except me. I stared at my plate, pushing the food around just like I used to do as a child. "Where did you say you're living now?" Grace asked, though I hadn't mentioned it yet. "I found a place on Cedar Street," I replied quietly. The table erupted in theatrical gasps. "Cedar Street?" Grace's eyes widened in mock concern. "Oh, Stella, that's literally the worst neighborhood in the city." Only she paused for effect. "Well, you know, people who can't afford better live there." "Beggars, she means beggars," Mom stage whispered, and they all laughed again. Something inside me snapped. 4 years of distance hadn't changed anything. They were still the same cruel, judgmental people they'd always been. I stood up so abruptly, my chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You know what? I'd rather be a beggar than be like any of you," I spat out. "At least I got where I am on my own without riding on someone else's coattails or living off Daddy's money." I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, ignoring their protests and accusations. As I walked out into the night, I promised myself it would be the last time I ever set foot in their presence. Life has a funny way of surprising you just when you think you've hit a dead end. I was still working at the small trading company, doing my best but feeling stuck, when my phone rang one afternoon. It was Lisa, my old college roommate. "Stella, you're not going to believe this," she was practically shouting with excitement. "Remember how we always talked about working for Maxwell Investment Group? They're opening an office in your city, and they're looking for fresh talent. I already put in a good word for you." My heart started racing. Maxwell was one of the biggest names in investment management. I spent that night updating my resume, and the next week preparing for the interview. When I walked into their temporary office, I felt like everything in my life had been leading to this moment. The interview wasn't easy. They grilled me on everything from market trends to specific investment strategies. But all those extra hours I'd put in at my current job, all the additional research I'd done in my free time, it all paid off. A week later, I got the call I was in. From day one, I threw myself into the work. While others went home at 5, I stayed late, developing new investment strategies and refining my project proposals. My first major project was managing a portfolio for a mid-sized tech company. When it yielded a 40% return in the first quarter, people started noticing. "Stella, this is exceptional work," my supervisor said during my 6-month review. Along with his praise came a bonus that was larger than my entire year's salary at the previous company. But it wasn't enough. I worked harder, took on bigger projects, built a reputation for turning struggling investments into gold mines. The bonuses kept getting bigger, and I had a plan for every penny. 2 years after starting at Maxwell, I walked into a luxury car dealership. The salesman probably thought I was lost until I pointed to their top-of-the-line model and said, "I'll take that one." An hour later, I was pulling up to my grandparents' house in a gleaming new car, complete with a giant red bow on top. Grandpa's jaw dropped when I handed him the keys, but I wasn't done. The next month, I closed on a stunning apartment in the Heights, the most prestigious new development in the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, and a view that made you feel like you owned the whole city. I was walking out of my building one morning, coffee in hand, when I heard a familiar voice. "Stella?" Grace stood there in her designer workout gear, looking like she'd seen a ghost. "What are you doing here?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. "Oh, I live here," I said casually, pointing to the penthouse level of the building. "Just bought it, actually." The look on Grace's face was priceless, a mixture of disbelief, shock, and something else. For the first time in our lives, I saw envy in my perfect sister's eyes. A week after my encounter with Grace, my phone rang. Seeing my parents' number on the screen was surprising enough. They hadn't called me in years. Even more surprising was that they were in the neighborhood and wanted to stop by. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. When they walked into my apartment, their expressions were priceless. Mom's eyes darted from the panoramic windows to the designer furniture, while Dad stood awkwardly in the entrance as if afraid to touch anything. "This is quite impressive." Mom managed, running her finger along my marble kitchen counter. "You must be doing very well for yourself." "I am," I replied, simply offering them seats on my Italian leather sofa. They exchanged glances before Mom cleared her throat. "Well, we actually have some news. Grace is engaged to Thomas. They announced it last month at the engagement party." An engagement party I hadn't been invited to, of course. They're planning the wedding for 6 months from now, Mom continued, her voice getting that familiar wheedling tone I remembered from childhood. We've offered to pay half the expenses as is traditional. Dad shifted uncomfortably. But it seems the total budget is, well, it's $300,000. I nearly choked on my water. $300,000? Thomas's family has certain expectations, Mom explained quickly. They're very prominent in the community. We announced we'd cover half before we knew the amount, and now, she trailed off, looking at me meaningfully. Now you need $150,000. I finished for her. Exactly. Mom brightened. And since you're doing so well, living in this beautiful apartment, working at such a prestigious firm, you want me to give you the money, I said flatly. Loan, Dad interjected. We're asking for a loan. We'll pay you back, of course. We'll even get it notarized. We know it's a lot, Mom said quickly, but we can't back out now. It would be so embarrassing with Thomas's family. They're expecting a certain standard. Like when I wanted to go to college? I interrupted. When I begged you for help. When I offered to sign a legal document promising to pay you back, Mom's face flushed. That was different. Different how? Because it was me asking? Because you told me you don't borrow money on principle? Stella, be reasonable, Dad started. Reasonable? I stood up. Like you were reasonable when you told me I wasn't college material? When you offered me a waitress job instead of helping me get an education? When you let Grandpa sell his property to help me, while you saved all your money for Grace? That's not fair, Mom protested. No, what's not fair is that you're only here because you need something from me. You didn't invite me to the engagement party. You haven't spoken to me in years, and now you want $150,000? I walked to the door and opened it. I don't loan money on principle. I believe that's a family tradition, isn't it? Mom's face turned red with anger. How dare you throw our words back at us? After everything we've done for you. Everything you've done for me? I laughed bitterly. Please leave now. They stormed out, Mom muttering about ingratitude and Dad avoiding eye contact. As I closed the door behind them, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in my life I'd stood up to them on my own terms, in my own home, from a position of strength. My phone rang again the next day. This time it was Grace. What is wrong with you? She didn't even bother with a hello. Mom told me what happened. How can you be so selfish? I sat back in my office chair, watching the sunset through my panoramic windows. Selfish? That's rich coming from you, Grace. We're family, Stella. Family helps each other. You have the money. Everyone knows you're doing well now. Why won't you help with my wedding? I could almost laugh at the absurdity. Family? Now suddenly I'm family? What about when I was visiting your house and you all called me a beggar? When you mocked where I lived? When you laughed at my job? Was I family then? That was different, Grace protested. We were just teasing. You're being ridiculous now. No, what's ridiculous is that none of you spoke to me for years until you needed something. If you need money so badly, why don't you ask our parents? They're your real family after all. They made that clear enough over the years, you bitter, ungrateful bitch. Grace exploded. You think you're so much better than us now with your fancy apartment and your big job? You're still the same pathetic little sister who was never good enough. The line went dead as she hung up. I sat there for a moment, surprised to find that her words didn't hurt anymore. They just made me tired. A week later, I was having Sunday dinner at my grandparents' house, a tradition I'd kept up ever since college. Grandma was unusually quiet as she served the pot roast. Your parents called us yesterday, Grandpa finally said, his voice heavy. I put down my fork. Let me guess. They asked for money for the wedding? Grandma nodded. They're getting desperate, I think. Your mother had quite a lot to say about family obligations. When we told them we're retired and don't have that kind of money, Grandpa continued, your mother had the nerve to suggest we sell something. She said, well, you sold the land for Stella's college, didn't you? She suggested we sell the car I gave you? I was stunned. She actually suggested you sell your gift? That's when I hung up on her, Grandpa said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Told her that unlike some people, we don't sell gifts from family members who actually care about us. Grandma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The three of us sat there in understanding silence, bound together by something stronger than mere blood ties. Word travels fast in a small town, and my parents made sure it traveled even faster. Within weeks, their version of events had spread through our entire extended family and social circle. I started hearing snippets of their carefully crafted narrative from various sources. Did you hear about the younger daughter? My mother's friend loudly gossiped at the local grocery store, not realizing I was in the next aisle. Got some fancy job and now she thinks she's too good for her own family. Won't even speak to them anymore, says they're too poor for her now. At church, relatives would shoot disapproving glances my way when I visited with my grandparents. My Aunt Martha called one evening, heavy with judgment. Your mother told me you wouldn't even let her into your apartment when she came to visit. How could you treat your own mother that way? I could have corrected the record, could have told everyone how my parents had only reached out when they needed money, how they'd never supported my dreams, how they'd mocked and belittled me at every turn, but I'd learned long ago that trying to defend yourself against toxic people only gives them more ammunition. Instead, I focused on my work, spent time with my grandparents, and let the gossip swirl around me like autumn leaves in the wind. My grandparents knew the truth. They'd lived through every moment of it with me and that was enough. But with 2 weeks left before the wedding, Grace made one final attempt. She showed up at my apartment unannounced wearing her most expensive outfit and her most convincing smile. Stella, we need to talk, she said, brushing past me into the living room. This has gone on long enough. We're sisters, we shouldn't be fighting like this. I stood by the window, arms crossed, watching her settle herself on my sofa as if she owned it. "Why are you really here, Grace?" To make peace, she gave me her best pageant winner smile. "And to help you understand the situation better. You see, Thomas's parents are not just rich, they're old money. They have connections everywhere. The wedding has to be perfect." I waited knowing there was more. "The final payments are due next week, the restaurant deposit, the wedding planner's fee, the flowers." She twisted her engagement ring nervously. "If Mom and Dad can't contribute their share, it's going to be so embarrassing. Thomas's parents will find out they couldn't afford it. It won't just reflect badly on Mom and Dad, it'll reflect on me. On my future with Thomas. So this visit isn't really about reconciling, it's about the money." "No, well, yes, but," she stood up and walked over to me, placing her hand on my arm. "Stella, please, you're my sister, I need your help. We need to make a great impression on Thomas's parents." I gently removed her hand, walked to the door and opened it. "I don't care about impressing Thomas's parents, I don't care about your perfect wedding, and I definitely don't care what any of you think anymore. You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You'll regret this." I smiled, feeling genuinely at peace. "No, Grace. For the first time in my life I'm absolutely certain I won't." A few days after Grace's visit, my phone lit up with a text from Sarah, her college friend who'd always been kind to me. She thought I should know what had happened at the country club the previous evening. "Your parents finally had to come clean to Thomas's family," she wrote. "They couldn't dodge the wedding planner's calls anymore. It was apparently quite a scene. I could picture it clearly. The elegant country club dining room, Thomas's wealthy parents in their designer clothes. The moment my parents had to admit they couldn't afford their share of the wedding expenses." According to Sarah, Thomas's mother had practically turned purple with rage. The carefully planned fairy tale wedding began to unravel, the honeymoon suite in the Maldives cancelled, the vintage champagne orders scaled back, the designer flower arrangements simplified. Thomas's parents eventually agreed to cover all the expenses themselves, but the damage was done. The wedding did go forward, though scaled down from its original grandeur. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't expect to be. My grandparents received an invitation but declined to attend, sending a polite note about prior commitments. We spent that Saturday together instead, having a picnic in their backyard, steadfastly avoiding any mention of the event taking place across town. A week later, the wedding photos appeared on social media. I found myself scrolling through them one evening, wineglass in hand, studying the faces in each carefully staged shot. There was Grace in her designer gown. Thomas looked stiff and formal, his family arranged around him like expensive statues, and my parents, they were easy to spot in their new outfits, probably bought on credit, trying so hard to look like they belonged in this world of old money and country club memberships. But their smiles were strained, their poses awkward. Thomas's parents appeared in only a few photos, their expressions ranging from barely concealed disdain to outright displeasure. In one particularly telling shot, his mother was caught looking at my parents with the kind of expression usually reserved for something unpleasant found on the bottom of one's shoe. Sarah texted me updates occasionally in the weeks that followed. Grace and Thomas moved into a house his parents had bought them as a wedding gift. My parents rarely visited. Apparently they weren't quite what Thomas's family had envisioned for Sunday dinners. I haven't spoken to my parents or Grace since before the wedding. I doubt I ever will again, but sitting here in my apartment, watching the sunset paint the city sky in shades of gold, I finally feel at peace with that fact. Some bridges, once burned, should stay ashes.